Welcome, weary wanderer of the wasteland, to the complete chronicle of America's most beloved beverage, Nuka-Cola. Tonight, we'll journey through the fizzy history of the drink that captured hearts and taste buds from sea to shining sea, long before the Great War changed everything. From its humble beginnings in a modest laboratory to its reign as the undisputed king of carbonated refreshment, this is a tale of ambition, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of the perfect cola. So settle in, let the gentle hum of distant machinery lull you into comfort, and prepare for a soothing exploration of liquid legend. The year 1944 dawned bright with promise over an America that still believed in its own boundless potential, where innovation flowed like water through the veins of industry, and every laboratory held the possibility of the next great breakthrough that would change the world forever. In countless research facilities across the nation, scientists and inventors toiled over formulations and equations, seeking that perfect combination of ingredients that would capture the American palate and transform ordinary citizens into devoted customers willing to part with their hard-earned nickels for just one more taste of manufactured perfection. Among these countless dreamers and chemists, one man stood apart not through genius or revolutionary insight, but through an almost obsessive dedication to the pursuit of the perfect cola. John Caleb Bradburton had not been born to wealth or privilege, had not inherited vast laboratories or teams of researchers. Instead, he possessed something far more dangerous to the established order, an absolute conviction that he could create something better than anything that had come before, a beverage that would not merely quench thirst but would become an essential part of the American experience. Bradburton's laboratory was a modest affair, housed in the basement of a rented building in downtown Boston, equipped with second-hand chemistry equipment, and powered by the kind of relentless determination that had built empires from nothing more than vision and stubbornness. Here, surrounded by bubbling beakers and notebooks filled with crossed-out formulas, he began the work that would consume 2 full years of his life and eventually reshape the landscape of American commerce in ways he could never have imagined. The early experiments were disasters of the most spectacular kind, producing concoctions that ranged from merely unpalatable to actively dangerous to human health. Bradburton's first attempts at carbonated beverages resulted in solutions that ate through their containers, syrups so acidic they stripped the enamel from test subjects' teeth, and flavoring combinations that induced violent nausea in anyone brave enough to attempt consumption. But each failure taught him something new about the delicate balance required to create a beverage that would be both appealing and safe, lessons purchased with countless hours of work and significant financial sacrifice. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not through systematic experimentation but through one of those happy accidents that seem to define the greatest discoveries in human history. Bradburton had been working late into the night, combining various fruit extracts in combinations that his exhausted mind thought might produce interesting results. The laboratory was filled with the competing aromas of 17 different fruit essences: passion fruit and cherry, orange and grape, exotic flavors from distant lands mixed with familiar tastes from American orchards. In his fatigue, he accidentally knocked over a bottle of concentrated vanilla extract, watching in horror as the precious liquid spilled directly into his latest experimental batch. Rather than beginning again with fresh ingredients, Bradburton decided to test the contaminated mixture, expecting nothing more than another entry in his growing catalogue of failures. The first sip stopped him cold, his taste buds registering something entirely unexpected, a flavor profile that was simultaneously familiar and revolutionary. Combining the tartness of citrus with the sweetness of stone fruits in a harmony that seemed to unlock some fundamental truth about human desire for perfectly balanced refreshment. The vanilla, rather than ruining the mixture, had provided exactly the mellowing agent needed to bind the 17 fruit flavors into a cohesive whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. But Bradburton understood that, flavor alone would not be sufficient to create the commercial success he envisioned. The American market demanded beverages that provided more than mere taste. They wanted products that promised health benefits, energy enhancement, and social status, all delivered in a single bottle. The solution came through what would later be recognized as one of the most audacious marketing decisions in the history of American commerce: the addition of enough sugar to provide 120% of the recommended daily allowance in every single serving. The sugar content that Bradburton incorporated into his formula was not accidental or the result of miscalculation, but a deliberate choice based on his understanding that sweetness triggered pleasure responses in the human brain that could create powerful psychological associations with his product. He had observed how customers at soda fountains gravitated toward the sweetest available options, how children begged their parents for candy and sugary treats with an intensity that suggested something deeper than simple preference. By creating a beverage that delivered unprecedented levels of sweetness while masking that intensity behind the complex fruit flavor profile, Bradburton was essentially engineering addiction into every bottle. The health implications of consuming such massive quantities of sugar were either unknown or deliberately ignored during this period, when the long-term effects of high-sugar diets had not yet been documented by medical science. Bradburton marketed his creation as a health tonic, claiming that the fruit flavors provided essential vitamins while the sugar offered immediate energy that busy Americans needed to maintain their productive lifestyles. These claims were supported by no scientific evidence whatsoever, but they resonated with a population that wanted to believe they could improve their health while indulging in pleasure. The addition of aspartame to the formula created even more complex chemistry, as this artificial sweetener was nearly 200 times more potent than traditional sugar while providing no calories. The combination of natural sugars and artificial sweeteners in the same beverage created flavor profiles that human taste buds had never encountered in nature, triggering reward pathways in the brain that had evolved to respond to the much more moderate sweetness found in fruits and honey. The result was a beverage that was literally irresistible to many consumers, creating craving patterns that would drive sales for decades to come. The carbonation process that Bradburton developed was equally innovative, using pressure levels and gas mixtures that created an effervescent experience unlike any other beverage on the market. The bubbles were not merely a novelty, but served important functions in delivering flavor compounds to the taste buds and creating the distinctive mouthfeel that would become synonymous with his brand. The carbonation also served as a preservation method, creating an acidic environment that prevented bacterial growth while extending shelf life far beyond what natural fruit juices could achieve without refrigeration. The bottling process required innovations in glass manufacturing and quality control that pushed the boundaries of available technology. Bradburton insisted on bottles that could maintain carbonation levels for months while resisting the chemical interactions that might alter flavor profiles over time. The distinctive bottle shape that eventually became iconic was not merely aesthetic, but served functional purposes, distributing pressure evenly while creating a form factor that was comfortable to hold and drink from while still being stackable for efficient shipping and storage. The first commercial production runs were small affairs, with Bradburton personally overseeing every aspect of the manufacturing process from mixing to bottling to labeling. He tested each batch himself, developing a palate so refined that he could detect minute variations in flavor balance that might indicate problems with ingredient quality or mixing procedures. This attention to detail, while time-consuming and expensive, ensured that early customers received a consistently high-quality product that lived up to the promises made in his increasingly bold advertising campaigns. The marketing strategy that Bradburton developed was revolutionary in its sophistication and understanding of consumer psychology. Rather than simply advertising his cola as a beverage, he positioned it as an essential component of the American lifestyle, a product that modern, successful people consumed as part of their daily routine. His advertisements appeared in newspapers and magazines across the country, featuring testimonials from satisfied customers who claimed that Nuka-Cola had improved their energy levels, enhanced their work performance, and even strengthened their romantic relationships. The testimonials were not fabricated, though they were carefully selected from hundreds of responses to represent the most enthusiastic reactions to the product. Many customers did report increased energy and improved mood after consuming Nuka-Cola, effects that could be attributed to the massive sugar and caffeine content rather than any mystical properties of the fruit flavor blend. But in an era before consumer protection regulations, these genuine but misleading testimonials provided powerful marketing material that drove sales throughout the growing network of distributors. The distribution network that Bradburton established during these early years would become the foundation for his company's eventual dominance of the American beverage market. Rather than attempting to compete directly with established soda fountain operators, he focused on creating relationships with grocery stores, restaurants, and specialty shops that were eager to offer their customers something new and exciting. The profit margins on Nuka-Cola were generous enough to provide attractive incentives to retailers while still allowing for significant reinvestment in marketing and product development. The first major expansion beyond Boston came when a distributor in New York placed an order for 5,000 bottles, more than Bradburton had ever produced in a single batch. The challenge of scaling up production while maintaining quality control required significant investment in new equipment and staff training, pushing the company to the edge of bankruptcy as Bradburton borrowed heavily against future sales projections. But the New York launch was a spectacular success, with demand quickly outstripping supply and creating waiting lists that only increased the product's desirability among status-conscious consumers. The regional variations that began appearing during this expansion phase were not intentional, but resulted from differences in local water supplies and ingredient availability. Nuka-Cola, produced in different cities, had subtly different flavor profiles, creating loyal followings among consumers who believed their local version was superior to variants produced elsewhere. Rather than standardizing the formula to eliminate these variations, Bradburton embraced them as evidence of his product's artisanal quality and local relevance, turning what could have been a quality control problem into a marketing advantage. The first celebrity endorsements came naturally as entertainment figures and social influencers discovered Nuka-Cola and began incorporating it into their public personas. Movie stars were photographed drinking the distinctive bottles at premieres and social events. Athletes credited improved performance to their Nuka-Cola consumption, and politicians began serving it at campaign events as a symbol of their connection to American innovation and entrepreneurship. These endorsements were often unpaid and unsolicited, testimony to the genuine appeal of the product among influential Americans. The competition's response to Nuka-Cola's growing success was swift and sometimes desperate, with established beverage companies attempting to create their own versions of highly sweetened, heavily flavored colas. But these efforts were hampered by their commitment to existing product lines and their inability to match the precise flavor balance that Bradburton had achieved through years of experimentation. Many of these competitor products were obvious imitations that only served to highlight the superiority of the original formula while providing free advertising for the Nuka-Cola brand. The scientific analysis that Bradburton conducted on competitor products revealed the extent to which other companies were struggling to understand his success. Chemical breakdowns of rival colas showed attempts to reverse engineer his formula, but these efforts invariably failed to capture the essential elements that made Nuka-Cola uniquely appealing. The 17 fruit flavor combination was particularly difficult to replicate, as the specific proportions and extraction methods that Bradburton used were closely guarded trade secrets that he shared with no one outside his immediate inner circle. The early addiction cases that began appearing among regular Nuka-Cola consumers were initially dismissed as psychological rather than physiological dependencies. Customers reported craving the beverage, experiencing headaches and irritability when unable to obtain it, and consuming increasing quantities to maintain their sense of well-being. Bradburton's response to these reports was to frame them as evidence of his product's superior quality, rather than cause for concern, arguing that people naturally wanted more of something that made them feel good and productive. The medical community's understanding of sugar addiction and caffeine dependency was still limited during this period, and the long-term health consequences of consuming high-sugar beverages were not yet documented in scientific literature. This knowledge gap allowed Bradburton to continue marketing Nuka-Cola as a health product, even as evidence accumulated that regular consumption might be creating physiological dependencies in some users. The distinction between enthusiasm and addiction was deliberately blurred in marketing materials that celebrated customer loyalty and repeat purchases as evidence of product satisfaction. The expansion into rural markets presented unique challenges as distribution networks outside major cities were less developed and consumer preferences often favored traditional beverages like milk, water, and homemade fruit drinks. Bradburton's solution was to position Nuka-Cola as a modern, sophisticated alternative that connected rural Americans with the exciting lifestyle changes occurring in urban areas. The marketing emphasized how Nuka-Cola could transform ordinary moments into special occasions, turning a simple afternoon break into a taste of metropolitan sophistication. The international expansion opportunities that began presenting themselves during this period were initially rejected by Bradburton, who believed that his formula was specifically designed for American tastes and might not translate successfully to foreign markets. This decision would later be recognized as a strategic error that allowed international competitors to establish dominant positions in global markets. But during the early years, it allowed for complete focus on perfecting the American distribution network and building the kind of brand loyalty that would sustain the company through future challenges. The workforce that Bradburton assembled during these expansion years reflected his commitment to quality control and his understanding that every employee was a potential ambassador for his brand. Production workers were trained not just in manufacturing procedures, but in the history and philosophy behind Nuka-Cola, creating a corporate culture where everyone understood their role in maintaining the standards that had made the product successful. This investment in employee education and engagement would prove crucial as the company grew beyond the point where Bradburton could personally oversee every aspect of operations. And so the foundation was laid for what would become America's most beloved beverage empire, built not through corporate planning or inherited wealth, but through one man's obsessive pursuit of perfection in a bottle. The formula that emerged from those 2 years of experimentation would remain essentially unchanged for decades to come, testament to Bradburton's intuitive understanding of human desires and his ability to transform scientific knowledge into commercial success. The stage was set for expansion beyond anything the modest laboratory had ever imagined, as America prepared to embrace the fizzy revolution that would reshape its relationship with refreshment forever. The success that followed Nuka-Cola's initial market penetration transformed John Caleb Bradburton from a modest chemist working in a basement laboratory into one of America's most influential corporate leaders, commanding resources and wielding influence that would reshape not only the beverage industry, but the very fabric of American consumer culture. The rapid expansion that began in the late 1940s occurred with such breathtaking speed that even Bradburton himself seemed surprised by the magnitude of demand his creation had unleashed across a nation suddenly hungry for the distinctive taste of his 17-fruit formula. The corporate infrastructure that emerged to support this expansion was unlike anything the American business world had seen before, combining the methodical precision of scientific research with the aggressive marketing tactics that would define modern consumer capitalism. Bradburton understood instinctively that maintaining his competitive advantage required not only protecting the secrets of his formula, but actively working to prevent competitors from developing viable alternatives that might capture even small portions of his growing market share. The mysterious natural flavors that formed the heart of Nuka-Cola's distinctive taste became the subject of intense speculation and industrial espionage as competitors attempted to reverse engineer the formula that had captured America's collective palate. Bradburton had deliberately obscured the true nature of these ingredients in his public statements and patent filings, referring only to proprietary fruit essences and specially processed natural extracts that provided no useful information to those seeking to understand the precise chemistry behind his success. The 17 distinct fruit flavors that comprised this carefully guarded blend represented years of experimentation with exotic ingredients sourced from around the world, many of which were unknown to American consumers and unavailable through normal commercial channels. Passion fruit from South American plantations, dragon fruit from Southeast Asian orchards, and rare citrus varieties from Mediterranean groves were combined with more familiar flavors like apple and cherry to create a taste profile that was simultaneously exotic and comfortingly familiar to the American palate. The passion fruit shortage that struck in 2044 created the first major crisis in Nuka-Cola's brief but meteoric history, threatening to disrupt the carefully balanced flavor profile that had made the beverage so irresistible to consumers. The shortage resulted from a combination of crop failures in key growing regions and increased demand from other food manufacturers who had discovered the unique properties of passion fruit as a flavor enhancer. Suddenly, the ingredient that provided the distinctive tartness underlying Nuka-Cola's sweetness became virtually unavailable at any price. Bradburton's response to this crisis demonstrated the ruthless business acumen that would characterize his corporate leadership throughout the coming decades. Rather than accepting reduced availability or increased costs for passion fruit, he dispatched teams of agricultural specialists and business negotiators to South America with instructions to secure exclusive long-term contracts with passion fruit growers, effectively cornering the market and preventing competitors from accessing this crucial ingredient. The contracts were structured to provide guaranteed income to growers in exchange for exclusive supply arrangements that would last for decades. But even these aggressive procurement strategies could not immediately solve the shortage that had already disrupted production schedules and threatened to leave store shelves empty during the crucial summer selling season. The temporary reformulation that Bradburton implemented to address the passion fruit shortage became a masterclass in crisis management and consumer psychology, demonstrating how apparent setbacks could be transformed into marketing opportunities that actually strengthened brand loyalty. The slight alteration to Nuka-Cola's flavor profile that resulted from substituting alternative fruit essences for the temporarily unavailable passion fruit was noticed immediately by regular consumers, whose palates had become finely attuned to the beverage's precise taste characteristics. Rather than attempting to conceal or minimize these changes, Bradburton made the bold decision to acknowledge them openly while positioning the temporary reformulation as evidence of his commitment to using only the finest natural ingredients available. The marketing campaign that accompanied this temporary formula change emphasized the artisanal nature of Nuka-Cola production and the company's refusal to compromise on quality, even when faced with ingredient shortages that might tempt lesser manufacturers to use inferior substitutes. Advertisements explained that the slight taste variation was temporary and that normal production would resume as soon as high-quality passion fruit became available again, creating a sense of anticipation and exclusivity around the return of the original formula. This crisis management strategy succeeded beyond all expectations, actually increasing consumer loyalty and brand awareness as customers began paying closer attention to the subtle flavor variations that distinguished authentic Nuka-Cola from inferior imitations. The temporary shortage created a sense of scarcity and desirability that drove demand to even higher levels when normal production resumed, establishing patterns of consumer behavior that would prove crucial during future market challenges. The industrial espionage that surrounded Nuka-Cola's formula during this period reached levels of sophistication that rivaled international intelligence operations, with competing corporations employing former government agents and advanced surveillance technology in attempts to penetrate Bradburton's carefully guarded production facilities. Corporate spies attempted to bribe employees, plant listening devices in research laboratories, and even stage elaborate schemes designed to gain access to secured areas where formula documentation might be stored. Bradburton's counterintelligence operations were equally sophisticated, employing security consultants with military and intelligence backgrounds to protect his company's most valuable assets from corporate thieves. The production facilities were redesigned with multiple layers of security, compartmentalized information systems that prevented any single employee from accessing the complete formula, and surveillance systems that monitored not only external threats but potential internal security breaches as well. The psychological warfare that characterized these corporate espionage efforts extended beyond simple attempts to steal trade secrets into elaborate campaigns designed to undermine competitor morale and create paranoia within rival organizations. False information was deliberately leaked to suggest that Nuka-Cola's success was based on ingredients or processes that were completely different from the actual formula, sending competitors down expensive and ultimately fruitless research paths that consumed resources while producing no useful results. The early competition that emerged during this period came primarily from regional soda companies that attempted to create local alternatives to Nuka-Cola's growing national presence. These competitors understood that they could not match the resources or distribution networks that Bradburton was rapidly assembling, so they focused instead on appealing to local pride and traditional preferences that might resist the homogenizing influence of a nationally marketed product. But these regional competitors underestimated both the addictive qualities of Nuka-Cola's high-sugar formula and the sophisticated marketing techniques that Bradburton employed to associate his product with modernity, success, and social status. Local soda makers found that their traditional customers were abandoning familiar brands in favor of the exotic flavors and psychological satisfactions that only Nuka-Cola seemed able to provide, creating market disruptions that drove many established companies out of business within a few years. The bottle design evolution that occurred during this expansion period reflected Bradburton's understanding that packaging was not merely functional, but served as a crucial component of brand identity and consumer appeal. The original bottles had been simple affairs, designed primarily to contain the beverage safely while minimizing production costs. But as competition intensified and shelf space became more valuable, Bradburton recognized that distinctive packaging could serve as a powerful marketing tool that would help his product stand out in increasingly crowded retail environments. The iconic bottle shape that eventually became synonymous with Nuka-Cola was the result of extensive research into consumer psychology and ergonomic design principles. The curved silhouette was not only visually appealing, but felt comfortable in the hand while creating a distinctive profile that was immediately recognizable even from a distance. The blue-tinted glass that became standard for Nuka-Cola bottles served both aesthetic and functional purposes, filtering light in ways that preserved flavor while creating visual associations with purity and refreshment. The labeling innovations that accompanied these packaging improvements represented some of the most advanced graphic design work of the era, employing color psychology and typography techniques that had been developed for luxury consumer goods but had never before been applied to mass-market beverages. The distinctive logo that appeared on every bottle became one of the most recognized symbols in American commerce, more familiar to consumers than many government insignia or religious symbols. The marketing campaigns that supported this expansion were revolutionary in their sophistication and their understanding of the emerging science of consumer behavior. Rather than simply advertising product features and benefits, these campaigns created emotional associations between Nuka-Cola consumption and desirable lifestyle characteristics like success, sophistication, and social acceptance. The advertisements suggested that choosing Nuka-Cola was not merely a beverage decision but a statement about personal values and aspirations. The celebrity endorsements that became a hallmark of Nuka-Cola marketing during this period were carefully orchestrated to reach different demographic segments while maintaining consistent brand messaging across all campaigns. Movie stars associated the product with glamour and excitement. Athletes connected it with energy and performance, and business leaders linked it with success and productivity. These endorsements were supported by extensive market research that identified which personalities would be most effective with specific target audiences. The demographic targeting that characterized these marketing efforts was unprecedented in its precision and scope, employing newly developed statistical techniques to identify and reach potential customers, with messages specifically designed to appeal to their particular interests and concerns. Working mothers received advertisements emphasizing how Nuka-Cola could provide the energy needed to manage busy schedules, while teenagers were targeted with messages about social acceptance and peer approval that would come from consuming the right beverage. The distribution network expansion that supported this marketing blitz required massive investments in transportation, infrastructure, warehouse facilities, and retail relationships that transformed Nuka-Cola from a regional specialty product into a national brand with presence in every major market. The logistics of maintaining product freshness and availability across such vast distances posed challenges that had never been solved in the beverage industry, requiring innovations in preservation, packaging, and supply chain management that would influence commerce far beyond the soda business. The exclusive distribution agreements that Bradburton negotiated with major retailers gave Nuka-Cola preferential shelf placement and promotional support in exchange for guaranteed minimum purchase volumes and restricted access to competing products. These agreements effectively locked competitors out of the most desirable retail locations while ensuring that Nuka-Cola would be prominently displayed wherever consumers made beverage purchasing decisions. The pricing strategies that emerged during this expansion period demonstrated Bradburton's sophisticated understanding of consumer psychology and market dynamics. Rather than competing primarily on price, Nuka-Cola was positioned as a premium product that justified higher costs through superior quality and distinctive flavor characteristics. This premium positioning actually increased demand among status-conscious consumers who viewed expensive beverages as symbols of their economic success and refined taste. The quality control systems that were implemented to maintain consistency across the expanding production network represented some of the most advanced manufacturing management techniques of the era. Every batch of Nuka-Cola was subjected to rigorous testing procedures that verified not only safety and basic quality standards, but also adherence to the precise flavor profiles that consumers expected. Production facilities that failed to meet these exacting standards faced immediate shutdown until problems could be identified and corrected. The employee training programs that supported these quality control efforts created a workforce that was not merely technically competent but emotionally invested in the success of the Nuka-Cola brand. Workers at all levels received education about the company's history, values, and commitment to excellence, creating corporate loyalty that translated into superior performance and reduced turnover rates that gave Nuka-Cola significant advantages over competitors struggling with workforce instability. The research and development investments that Bradburton made during this period focused not only on product improvements but on developing new variations and extensions that could capture additional market segments without cannibalizing sales of the original formula. The diet version that was briefly mentioned by early consumers represented just one of many experimental products that were tested in limited markets to gauge consumer reaction and identify promising opportunities for future development. The international opportunities that began presenting themselves during this expansion period were initially viewed with caution by Bradburton, who recognized that success in foreign markets would require adaptations to local tastes and regulatory requirements that might compromise the formula integrity that had driven domestic success. The decision to focus on complete market domination within the United States before considering international expansion would later prove to be a strategic mistake that allowed foreign competitors to establish dominant positions in global markets. But during this period, it allowed for the complete attention and resources needed to build an unassailable domestic market position. The corporate culture that emerged during these expansion years reflected Bradburton's personal values and his vision of what a modern American company should represent to its employees, customers, and the broader society. The emphasis on innovation, quality, and customer satisfaction created an organizational identity that transcended simple profit-seeking to encompass broader goals of contributing to American prosperity and social progress through superior products and responsible business practices. And so the foundation was completed for what would become not merely a successful business, but a cultural institution that would define American consumer preferences and influence social behaviors for generations to come. The formula wars had been won, the competition had been vanquished, and the stage was set for the even greater innovations and market expansions that would transform Nuka-Cola from a popular beverage into an essential component of the American way of life, carrying forward the dreams and ambitions of a nation confident in its ability to create tomorrow's solutions to today's challenges. The late 2070s arrived in America with an atmosphere of technological optimism and corporate ambition that seemed to promise unlimited possibilities for innovation and market expansion, creating the perfect environment for John Caleb Bradburton to push his beloved Nuka-Cola brand into territories that previous generations of beverage manufacturers could never have imagined. The established success of his original formula had provided the financial resources and market confidence necessary to support the kind of experimental research and development that would either revolutionize the industry once again or risk everything on ideas that might prove too radical for consumer acceptance. The pressure for innovation came not only from Bradburton's own restless creative energy, but from the increasingly sophisticated competition that had emerged as other corporations finally began to understand the magnitude of the post-4-5 market opportunity that Nuka-Cola had created and dominated for over 3 decades. Regional competitors had learned to copy his marketing techniques and distribution strategies, while larger national corporations were developing their own heavily sweetened, artificially flavored beverages designed to capture portions of the lucrative market segment that Nuka-Cola had essentially created from nothing through superior chemistry and relentless promotion. The research laboratories that Bradburton had established during the expansion years of the 1950s and 60s had evolved into sophisticated facilities that rivaled the best corporate and university research centers in the PAMI country, employing teams of chemists, food scientists, and marketing specialists whose combined expertise represented decades of accumulated knowledge about consumer preferences and beverage technology. These facilities had become testing grounds for ideas that pushed far beyond conventional understanding of what carbonated beverages could be or do for the people who consumed them. The breakthrough that would define the next phase of Nuka-Cola's evolution came not from systematic research, but from one of those inspired moments of creative risk-taking that characterized truly revolutionary innovations. Bradburton had been experimenting with various additives that might enhance the energy-boosting properties that consumers already associated with his high sugar, high caffeine formula when he encountered a proposal from his nuclear chemistry consultants that seemed almost too audacious to consider seriously. The suggestion to incorporate radioactive materials into a consumer beverage would have been dismissed as either insane or criminally irresponsible by any conventional business leader, but Bradburton had never been conventional in his approach to product development or marketing strategy. The 1970s were a period of widespread public fascination with nuclear technology and its potential to solve various problems through the miraculous properties of atomic energy, making radioactive additives seem not dangerous, but excitingly modern and scientifically advanced. The specific isotope that captured Bradburton's imagination was strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear fission reactions that possessed several characteristics that made it seem ideally suited for incorporation into an enhanced version of his successful formula. The radioactive decay of strontium-90 produced high-energy electrons that could create the striking blue luminescence associated with Cherenkov radiation when these particles traveled through the liquid medium of the beverage at their speeds approaching the velocity of light. The science behind this phenomenon was complex, but well understood by nuclear physicists who had observed similar effects in research reactors and other facilities where radioactive materials interacted with water or other transparent media. The high-speed electrons produced by radioactive decay would create a characteristic blue glow as they exceeded the speed of light in the liquid medium, generating photons that would make the entire beverage appear to emit its own internal illumination. This visual effect was unlike anything that had ever been achieved in consumer products, creating possibilities for marketing campaigns that could position the new beverage not merely as an improved version of existing products, but as a completely revolutionary advance that represented the application of cutting-edge nuclear science to everyday consumer needs. The blue glow would serve as immediate visual proof that this was no ordinary soft drink but something that incorporated the most advanced technologies of the atomic age. But Bradburton understood that visual appeal alone would not be sufficient to justify the enormous risks and costs associated with incorporating radioactive materials into a mass-produced consumer product. The enhanced version would need to provide functional benefits that went beyond mere novelty to offer genuine improvements in the energy and performance characteristics that consumers had come to expect from Nuka-Cola products. The solution came through extensive research into the physiological effects of low-level radiation exposure, which suggested that carefully controlled doses of certain radioactive isotopes might actually stimulate cellular metabolism in ways that could enhance physical performance and mental alertness. This research, while preliminary and based on limited data from nuclear industry workers and military personnel, suggested possibilities for creating a beverage that would not merely provide energy through sugar and caffeine, but would actually enhance the body's ability to generate and utilize energy at the cellular level. The development of what would eventually become known as Nuka-Cola Quantum required years of experimentation to determine the precise levels of strontium-90 that would create the desired visual effects while remaining within what researchers believed to be safe exposure limits for regular consumption. The calculations were complex and based on radiation safety standards that had been developed for industrial workers rather than consumers, requiring extrapolation and estimation that introduced significant uncertainties into the safety assessments. The testing protocols that were established for this experimental beverage reflected the limited understanding of radiation health effects that characterized the period, relying heavily on short-term studies that measured immediate physiological responses rather than the long-term accumulation effects that would become the primary concern of later radiation safety research. Test subjects reported increased energy levels and enhanced physical performance that seemed to validate the theoretical predictions about cellular stimulation effects. The marketing research that accompanied product development revealed enthusiastic consumer response to the concept of a radioactively enhanced beverage, particularly among younger demographics who associated nuclear technology with progress and scientific advancement rather than danger and environmental contamination. Focus groups responded positively to the blue glow effect and expressed willingness to pay premium prices for a beverage that incorporated such obviously advanced technology. The production challenges associated with manufacturing a radioactive consumer beverage required innovations in handling, storage, and distribution that pushed existing industrial safety practices to their limits and beyond. Special facilities had to be constructed with radiation containment systems, worker protection protocols, and waste disposal procedures that had never before been applied to food and beverage manufacturing operations. The regulatory approval process for quantum presented unprecedented challenges as government agencies struggled to develop appropriate standards for a product category that had never existed before. The bureaucratic review involved multiple departments and agencies, each applying different criteria and safety standards that had been developed for entirely different applications, creating a complex approval process that required months of negotiations and documentation. The limited regional release strategy that was eventually approved reflected both regulatory caution and marketing sophistication, allowing for careful monitoring of consumer response and health effects while building anticipation and exclusivity around a product that was positioned as representing the future of beverage technology. The initial distribution was restricted to selected markets where consumer demographics suggested the highest likelihood of acceptance and the best opportunities for gathering meaningful data about long-term effects. The consumer response to quantum exceeded all projections, with demand quickly outstripping the limited production capacity that safety protocols had established for the experimental beverage. The blue glow effect created immediate visual impact that generated extensive word-of-mouth marketing, while the enhanced energy effects that consumers reported created loyal followings among athletes, students, and professionals who valued the performance benefits that regular Nuka-Cola could not provide. But the success of quantum also accelerated development of the flavored variants that would expand the Nuka-Cola product line beyond anything that had been attempted during the brand's earlier decades of growth and market dominance. The technical expertise and production capabilities that had been developed for quantum provided the foundation for creating numerous specialized products that could target specific consumer segments while maintaining the overall brand identity that had made Nuka-Cola successful. The cherry variant that emerged during this period combined the familiar cherry flavoring that had been popular in regional markets with enhanced formulations that provided distinctive visual and functional characteristics. The bright red coloration was achieved through careful selection of natural and artificial colorings that complemented the fruit flavoring while creating immediate visual distinction from both the original formula and the blue glowing quantum variant. The orange and grape variants followed similar development patterns, incorporating fruit flavors that had been tested in limited regional releases during earlier decades while adding the enhanced sugar content and specialized additives that characterized the new generation of Nuka-Cola products. Each variant required extensive testing to ensure that the flavor profiles were distinctly different while maintaining the essential characteristics that consumers associated with the Nuka-Cola brand. The Victory variant represented the most ambitious attempt to create a product that would appeal to patriotic sentiments, while delivering functional benefits that went beyond simple refreshment and energy enhancement. The orange-red coloration was designed to evoke associations with American flag symbolism, while the enhanced action point boosting properties were marketed as supporting the kind of productivity and achievement that characterized American values and aspirations. The wild variant took a different approach entirely, positioning itself as a root beer alternative that could compete directly with regional favorites like sarsaparilla while maintaining the distinctive Nuka-Cola characteristics that had made the brand successful. The formulation challenges were significant because root beer flavors required completely different chemical balancing than the fruit-based variants, demanding extensive research into flavor interactions and consumer acceptance patterns. The corporate acquisition strategy that accompanied these product developments represented a systematic effort to eliminate competition while acquiring the specialized knowledge and production capabilities that smaller companies had, developed for niche market segments. The acquisition of smaller soda companies provided not only established distribution networks and brand recognition, but also access to proprietary formulations and manufacturing techniques that could be incorporated into expanded Nuka-Cola product lines. The attempted acquisition of Sunset Sarsaparilla became one of the most closely watched corporate battles of the decade, representing a clash between Bradburton's national expansion strategy and regional companies that had built loyal customer bases through decades of local market focus. The failure of this acquisition attempt represented one of the few significant defeats in Bradburton's otherwise triumphant corporate career, demonstrating that some competitors possessed resources and market positions that even Nuka-Cola's overwhelming advantages could not easily overcome. The underhanded tactics that characterized many of these competitive battles reflected the enormous financial stakes involved in controlling various segments of the rapidly expanding beverage market. Industrial espionage, regulatory manipulation, and marketing campaigns designed to undermine competitor credibility became standard practices in an industry where market dominance could translate into billions of dollars in revenue and decades of competitive advantage. The relationship with Vim Corporation became particularly contentious as both companies sought to establish dominance in northeastern markets where local preferences and cultural traditions created opportunities for regional brands to compete successfully against national competitors. The legal battles over trademark disputes and advertising claims created precedents that would influence corporate competition strategies for decades to come. The pre-war advertising campaigns that supported these product launches represented the pinnacle of marketing sophistication, employing psychological research, demographic analysis, and media coordination techniques that had been developed by the most advanced advertising agencies in the country. These campaigns did not merely promote individual products, but created comprehensive brand narratives that positioned Nuka-Cola as an essential component of modern American life. The celebrity endorsements that characterized these campaigns were carefully orchestrated to reach different demographic segments while maintaining consistent messaging about innovation, quality, and American values. Movie stars, athletes, politicians, and business leaders were featured in advertisements that suggested successful people chose Nuka-Cola products not merely for refreshment but as symbols of their commitment to excellence and progress. The technological innovations that supported these marketing efforts included some of the earliest applications of television advertising, radio sponsorship, and print media coordination that would establish templates for integrated marketing campaigns throughout American commerce. The advertising budgets that Bradburton allocated to these campaigns were unprecedented in the beverage industry, reflecting his understanding that brand awareness and consumer loyalty were as important as product quality in determining long-term market success. And so the stage was set for the final phase of pre-war innovation and expansion that would establish Nuka-Cola not merely as a successful business enterprise, but as a cultural institution whose influence extended far beyond the beverage industry into the broader patterns of American consumer behavior and social identity. The quantum revolution had demonstrated that radical innovation was not only possible but profitable, encouraging even more ambitious experiments that would push the boundaries of what consumer products could be and do in an America that seemed ready to embrace any technology that promised to make life more exciting, more convenient, and more satisfying than previous generations had ever imagined possible. The final years before the Great War found Nuka-Cola at the absolute pinnacle of American corporate achievement, having transcended its origins as a simple beverage company to become something approaching a cultural institution whose influence permeated every aspect of daily life from coast to coast. The blue bottles had become as recognizable as the American flag itself, symbols of prosperity and innovation that represented everything the nation believed about its capacity to create a better future through technology, entrepreneurship, and the relentless pursuit of consumer satisfaction. The role that Nuka-Cola played in pre-war American culture extended far beyond mere refreshment into the realm of social identity and national pride, with consumption patterns that reflected not only personal preferences but political allegiances, class aspirations, and regional loyalties that had developed over decades of sophisticated marketing and cultural integration. Children learned to associate the distinctive taste with celebrations and rewards, while adults incorporated various Nuka-Cola products into their professional and social routines as markers of success and sophistication. The corporate empire that John Caleb Bradburton had built from his modest laboratory experiments had grown to encompass manufacturing facilities in every major industrial center, distribution networks that reached the most remote corners of the continental United States, and research operations that employed thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians whose collective expertise represented the cutting edge of food science, chemistry, and consumer psychology research. The military contracts that Nuka-Cola secured during the increasingly tense international situation of the late 70s reflected both the company's massive production capabilities and the government's recognition that civilian morale would be crucial during any extended conflict that might develop from the growing resource shortages and diplomatic tensions that characterized the period. These contracts called for specialized formulations that could provide enhanced energy and alertness for military personnel, while maintaining the familiar flavors that would remind soldiers of the civilian lives they were defending. The patriotic marketing campaigns that accompanied these military contracts positioned Nuka-Cola consumption as a form of civic duty, with advertisements suggesting that choosing American-made beverages over foreign alternatives was not merely a consumer preference, but an expression of loyalty to democratic values and national security interests. These campaigns resonated particularly strongly with consumers who were already anxious about international tensions and eager to demonstrate their patriotic credentials through their purchasing decisions. The final product launches before October 23, 2077, represented the culmination of decades of research and development, introducing innovations that pushed the boundaries of what consumers had come to expect from carbonated beverages, while maintaining the essential characteristics that had made Nuka-Cola successful throughout its remarkable history. These products incorporated the most advanced food science and packaging technologies available, creating sensory experiences that seemed almost miraculous to consumers who had grown up with simpler formulations. The Nuka-World theme park project represented perhaps the most ambitious expression of Bradburton's vision for his corporate legacy, transforming the company from a manufacturer of consumer products into a creator of immersive entertainment experiences that would celebrate both the Nuka-Cola brand and the broader themes of American innovation and achievement that the company had come to represent. The park was designed to be not merely an amusement destination, but a shrine to consumer capitalism and technological progress. The construction of Nuka-World required investments that dwarfed even the massive expenditures that had characterized the company's previous expansion phases, with specialized attractions, advanced automation systems, and environmental controls that represented the most sophisticated entertainment technology of the era. The park was intended to demonstrate that American creativity and engineering could create experiences that surpassed anything that had been achieved in human history, providing visitors with adventures that blended education, entertainment, and product promotion into seamless experiences. The grand opening celebration that had been planned for Nuka-World was intended to be a national event that would demonstrate American superiority in both technological innovation and cultural creativity. With media coverage, celebrity appearances, and government recognition that would establish the park as a symbol of everything that made America exceptional among the nations of the world. The marketing budget allocated to this opening exceeded the entire annual revenues of most American corporations. The last-minute distribution efforts that characterized the final months before the Great War reflected growing concerns about supply chain disruptions and resource availability that might affect the company's ability to maintain normal operations during the international crisis that seemed increasingly inevitable. Emergency stockpiling procedures were implemented at facilities throughout the country, with inventory levels that exceeded normal operational requirements by margins that reflected genuine concern about future availability. The distribution network that had been built over decades of careful expansion suddenly became a strategic national asset, with transportation and storage capabilities that could be adapted to support civilian emergency preparedness and military logistics if international tensions escalated into open conflict. Government planners had begun incorporating Nuka-Cola facilities into their contingency planning, recognizing that the company's infrastructure represented resources that might prove crucial during wartime conditions. The employee training programs that were accelerated during this period reflected both operational necessities and corporate responsibility concerns, ensuring that workers at all levels understood emergency procedures and safety protocols that might be needed if normal operations were disrupted by external events. These programs created a workforce that was prepared not only to maintain production under difficult conditions, but to serve broader community needs if circumstances required adaptation of normal business operations. The moment when the bombs fell on October 23, 2077 transformed Nuka-Cola from a thriving corporate enterprise into a frozen monument to the civilization that had created it, with facilities, products, and records that would serve as archaeological evidence of the heights that American consumer culture had achieved before its destruction in nuclear fire. The electromagnetic pulse that preceded the thermal and blast effects shut down the electrical systems that had maintained the complex logistical networks supporting global operations. The preservation of Nuka-Cola products in the aftermath of nuclear devastation became one of the most remarkable aspects of the post-war archaeological record, with bottles and cans that had survived in sealed environments maintaining their contents and even their carbonation levels through 2 centuries of abandonment and environmental degradation. The chemical stability that had been engineered into these products for normal shelf life purposes proved sufficient to maintain basic integrity even under the extreme conditions that followed nuclear warfare. The immediate post-war scavenging that began as soon as radiation levels decreased sufficiently to allow human movement revealed the extent to which Nuka-Cola had penetrated every aspect of pre-war life. With products discovered in homes, offices, vehicles, and public spaces throughout the devastated landscape, these discoveries provided survivors with not only desperately needed calories and hydration, but psychological connections to the world that had been lost in the nuclear holocaust. The survival of Nuka-Cola products became a source of comfort and normalcy for survivors who were struggling to maintain their sanity and humanity in conditions that seemed to negate everything they had previously understood about civilization and social organization. The familiar tastes provided anchors to personal memories and cultural identities that might otherwise have been completely erased by the trauma of civilizational collapse. The radiation effects that different Nuka-Cola variants experienced during and after the nuclear attacks created fascinating patterns that reflected both the original formulations and the specific types of radioactive contamination that characterized different geographical regions. Products that had been stored in underground facilities or shielded locations often emerged with minimal contamination, while those exposed to direct fallout absorbed radiation in ways that sometimes enhanced rather than degraded their original properties. The quantum variant proved particularly interesting in its post-war behavior, as the strontium-90 that had provided its distinctive blue glow interacted with additional radioactive contamination in ways that created complex chemical changes affecting both appearance and physiological effects. Some bottles developed enhanced luminescence that exceeded their original specifications, while others seemed to lose their radioactive properties entirely through unknown chemical processes. The legend that began forming around Nuka-Cola in the immediate post-war period reflected both its practical utility for survival and its psychological significance as a symbol of the lost world that survivors longed to restore or replace. Stories began circulating about miraculous healing properties, hidden caches of pristine products, and the possibility that somewhere in the wasteland, Nuka-Cola facilities might still be operating under automated systems that had survived the nuclear holocaust. The transition from corporate product to cultural icon occurred gradually as survivor communities began incorporating Nuka-Cola imagery, terminology, and mythology into their developing post-war cultures, creating new meanings and associations that reflected current needs and circumstances while maintaining connections to pre-war memories and aspirations. The distinctive bottles became currency, art objects, and religious symbols in different communities that had developed varying interpretations of their significance. The wasteland archaeology that emerged decades after the Great War revealed the extraordinary extent of Nuka-Cola's pre-war penetration into American society, with discoveries that included not only consumer products but corporate records, advertising materials, and industrial facilities that provided comprehensive documentation of how the company had operated during the final years before nuclear destruction. These archaeological sites became invaluable resources for understanding both corporate history and broader patterns of pre-war American culture. The preservation of corporate archives in underground facilities that had been designed to protect sensitive information from industrial espionage proved sufficient to protect these materials from nuclear destruction, creating treasure troves of documentation that would eventually enable post-war researchers to reconstruct detailed pictures of how Nuka-Cola had developed, marketed, and distributed its products throughout the pre-war period. The automated systems that had been installed in some Nuka-Cola facilities to improve efficiency and reduce labor costs proved remarkably durable in post-war conditions, with some machinery continuing to operate decades after human supervision had ended. These systems created the mysterious phenomena of Nuka-Cola products that appeared to be freshly manufactured despite the obvious absence of human workers, leading to legends about ghost factories and supernatural intervention in the production process. The vending machines that had been distributed throughout American cities and towns became some of the most reliable sources of preserved Nuka-Cola products, with their sealed environments and temperature control systems protecting contents from environmental degradation, while their automated dispensing mechanisms continued to function long after the civilization that had created them had disappeared. These machines became shrines and gathering places for survivor communities that had developed quasi-religious attitudes toward pre-war technology. The cultural impact of these discoveries extended far beyond simple nostalgia or practical utility into the realm of social organization and community identity, as groups formed around shared appreciation for Nuka-Cola products and competed for access to the most desirable variants and locations. The social hierarchies that developed around Nuka-Cola possession and knowledge reflected both its practical value and its symbolic significance as a connection to lost prosperity and technological sophistication. The environmental legacy of Nuka-Cola production facilities created unique ecological niches in the post-war landscape. With chemical contamination and industrial debris, that supported specialized plant and animal communities, adapted to the artificial conditions that these sites provided. Some of these locations became oases of biological diversity in otherwise desolate regions, creating complex relationships between industrial archaeology and natural recovery processes. And so ended the corporate phase of Nuka-Cola's extraordinary history. As the Great War transformed a thriving business enterprise into a cultural artifact whose influence would extend far beyond anything that John Caleb Bradburton had ever imagined during his years of laboratory experimentation and corporate empire building. The bottles that had once represented the pinnacle of consumer capitalism became relics of a lost civilization, treasured by survivors who would never know the complex history behind the simple pleasure of a cold, fizzy drink that connected them across the centuries to the dreams and ambitions of the world that had created them. 2 centuries after the Great War had transformed the world into a radioactive wasteland where survival itself had become humanity's primary occupation, the discovery of intact Nuka-Cola products scattered throughout the ruins of civilization provided survivors with something far more precious than simple refreshment or nostalgic comfort. In the harsh reality of post-nuclear existence, where clean water was scarce and medical supplies were virtually non-existent, these preserved beverages had undergone a remarkable transformation from luxury consumer goods into essential survival tools that could mean the difference between life and death for those brave enough to venture into the contaminated zones that had once been thriving cities. The capital wasteland that emerged from the ashes of the Washington metropolitan area became one of the most thoroughly documented regions for studying how Nuka-Cola products had adapted to post-war conditions, with extensive archaeological evidence revealing patterns of preservation, contamination, and utility that challenged conventional understanding of both food science and radiation biology. The bottles and cans that had survived 2 centuries of environmental extremes retained not only their contents but often their original carbonation levels, creating fizzy refreshment that seemed almost miraculous to wastelanders who had grown up knowing only flat, contaminated water and bitter herbal teas. The medicinal properties that Nuka-Cola had developed during its long exposure to low-level radiation created entirely new categories of therapeutic application that bore no resemblance to the original marketing claims about basial vitamins and energy enhancement. The sugar content that had once been criticized as excessive became a life-saving source of rapid energy for malnourished survivors, while the caffeine provided alertness and pain relief that could extend survival time during dangerous expeditions into highly contaminated areas. The healing effects that regular consumption provided were subtle but measurable, with 10 health points of restoration representing the difference between recovery and death for wasteland travelers who had been injured by raiders, mutant creatures, or environmental hazards that characterized daily existence in the post-war world. The radiation dose of 3 rads that accompanied each bottle was considered negligible compared to the background radiation that permeated most inhabited areas, making Nuka-Cola one of the safest sources of both hydration and nutrition available to wasteland communities. The pristine Nuka-Cola machines that had somehow continued operating throughout the post-war period became focal points for entire settlements, with communities organizing themselves around reliable access to these technological marvels that seemed to represent the last functioning remnants of pre-war civilization. The machines required no maintenance, accepted pre-war currency that could be scavenged from ruins, and dispensed products that appeared to be freshly manufactured despite the obvious absence of any functional industrial infrastructure. The ice-cold variants that could only be obtained from these mysterious machines provided double the healing benefits of room-temperature bottles, suggesting that the cooling process activated chemical reactions that enhanced the therapeutic properties of the preserved beverages. The mechanism behind this enhancement remained unexplained by wasteland scientists, leading to speculation about everything from quantum mechanical effects to supernatural intervention that reflected the limited understanding of advanced chemistry that characterized most post-war communities. The remarkable preservation of carbonation levels in these chilled products defied conventional understanding of gas solubility and chemical stability, with bottles that maintained their fizz indefinitely once removed from the machines, regardless of storage conditions or time elapsed since dispensing. This phenomenon became one of the most celebrated mysteries of wasteland science, inspiring countless theories about temporal manipulation, stasis fields, and other exotic explanations that reflected both the genuine wonder these effects inspired and the limited scientific knowledge available to post-war researchers. The Nuka-Cola quantum that survived the war in extremely limited quantities became one of the most sought-after substances in the wasteland, not only for its distinctive blue glow that provided light in the perpetual gloom of underground shelters, but for its remarkable ability to enhance physical performance in ways that exceeded anything the original pre-war marketing had promised. The 20 action points provided by each bottle could enable a wastelander to sprint longer distances, fight more effectively, or perform complex tasks with enhanced coordination and speed. The rarity of quantum created black market economies throughout the wasteland, with individual bottles commanding prices equivalent to weeks of scavenged goods or services that reflected both genuine utility and psychological desire for connection to the most advanced pre-war technology. The 108 bottles that could be found throughout the capital wasteland became the objects of elaborate quests and dangerous expeditions that sometimes cost more lives than the beverages could ultimately save. The addiction potential that quantum possessed represented one of the most troubling aspects of its post-war legacy, with the 10% chance of developing dependence creating communities of addicts whose craving for the blue glowing beverage drove them to increasingly desperate and dangerous behavior. The withdrawal symptoms included reduced charisma and radiation resistance that made affected individuals less effective in social situations while simultaneously more vulnerable to the environmental hazards that characterized wasteland existence. The glowing urine that resulted from quantum consumption became a badge of status among certain wasteland communities, visible proof that the consumer had access to the rarest and most advanced beverages available in the post-war world. This biological marker created social hierarchies based on quantum consumption patterns, with individuals competing to demonstrate their access to pre-war luxuries through increasingly conspicuous displays of radioactive waste products. The regional variations that had developed across different areas of the former United States reflected both the diverse storage conditions that products had experienced during the war and the varying types of radiation exposure that had affected different geographical regions. The Commonwealth, New California Republic, and Mojave Wasteland each possessed distinct Nuka-Cola cultures that had evolved around the specific varieties and conditions that characterized their local environments. The New Vegas region presented particularly interesting examples of how local conditions had affected Nuka-Cola preservation and utilization, with desert storage providing different preservation characteristics than the humid conditions of the capital wasteland or the varied climates of the California territories. The dry heat had concentrated flavors while reducing carbonation levels, creating taste profiles that were more intense but less effervescent than their eastern counterparts. The hardcore survival conditions that characterized the Mojave Wasteland created additional challenges for Nuka-Cola consumption, as the dehydrating effects of high sugar content could actually worsen survival prospects for travelers who were already struggling with water scarcity and heat exhaustion. The sleep-fighting effects that caffeine provided became crucial for maintaining alertness during dangerous night travel, but could also contribute to dangerous overexertion and poor decision-making during extended expeditions. The rum and Nuka that emerged as a popular mixed drink in New Vegas demonstrated how post-war communities had begun adapting pre-war products to create new consumption experiences that reflected current needs and available Resources. The combination of alcohol and caffeine provided both social lubrication and functional alertness that made it popular among traders, gamblers, and other individuals whose survival depended on complex social negotiations and risk assessment. The psychological impact of consuming pre-war beverages extended far beyond their nutritional or medicinal value into the realm of cultural identity and emotional well-being, providing wastelanders with tangible connections to the lost world that their grandparents had inhabited before nuclear fire transformed everything familiar into something alien and dangerous. The taste memories that these products evoked could provide comfort and stability during psychological crises that threatened individual sanity and community cohesion. The trading economies that developed around Nuka-Cola products reflected both their practical utility and their symbolic value as representations of pre-war prosperity and technological sophistication. Bottles became standardized units of exchange in communities where traditional currency had lost all meaning, with different variants commanding prices that reflected both rarity and functional benefits that could be quantified in terms of survival advantage. The religious and quasi-religious movements that incorporated Nuka-Cola imagery and symbolism into their belief systems demonstrated how desperate communities sought meaning and hope in artifacts from the lost golden age of American prosperity. These belief systems often attributed supernatural properties to the beverages, creating elaborate mythologies that explained their preservation and effects through divine intervention rather than chemical processes. The social stratification that emerged around access to different Nuka-Cola variants created new forms of inequality that were based not on traditional wealth or political power, but on knowledge about locations, ability to navigate dangerous territory, and connections to trading networks that could provide access to the rarest products. These hierarchies reflected both genuine differences in survival capability and arbitrary advantages that had little relationship to individual merit or social contribution. The scientific research that post-war communities conducted on preserved Nuka-Cola products revealed both the remarkable sophistication of pre-war food science and the limitations of wasteland analytical capabilities, creating bodies of knowledge that were simultaneously accurate in their observations and wildly incorrect in their theoretical explanations. The lack of proper laboratory equipment and reference materials led to conclusions that mixed genuine insights with speculation and folklore in ways that reflected the intellectual constraints imposed by civilizational collapse. The environmental impact studies that were attempted by various wasteland research groups suggested that Nuka-Cola production facilities had created unique ecological conditions that supported specialized plant and animal communities, adapted to the chemical signatures that characterized these industrial sites. Some researchers speculated that the sugar-rich waste products had provided nutrients that enabled rapid biological recovery in areas that might otherwise have remained sterile for centuries. The psychological dependency that many wastelanders developed on Nuka-Cola products represented a complex phenomenon that combined genuine appreciation for their practical benefits with nostalgia for a world that most consumers had never personally experienced. This dependency often manifested as compulsive collecting behavior, with individuals hoarding bottles far beyond any reasonable consumption needs while simultaneously feeling anxiety about depleting their stockpiles through actual use. The community rituals that developed around Nuka-Cola consumption created social bonding experiences that helped maintain group cohesion and individual morale during the extended stress periods that characterized wasteland existence. Sharing rare variants became ceremonies that marked important occasions and reinforced social relationships, while competitive consumption became a form of entertainment that provided distraction from daily survival concerns. The medical applications that wasteland doctors discovered for various Nuka-Cola products expanded far beyond simple nutrition and hydration into specialized treatments for radiation sickness malnutrition, and psychological disorders that were endemic in post-war communities. The precise dosages and treatment protocols that were developed through trial and error created bodies of medical knowledge that were passed down through apprenticeship systems that preserved crucial survival information across generations. And so the transformation was complete, as Nuka-Cola evolved from a commercial product designed to generate corporate profits into an essential component of post-war survival that provided not only physical sustenance but psychological comfort, social organization, and cultural continuity that helped maintain human civilization during its darkest period. The bottles that had once represented the pinnacle of consumer marketing had become lifelines connecting isolated communities to their shared heritage and hopes for eventual recovery from the catastrophe that had reshaped their world forever. The discovery of Nuka-World in the year 2287 represented one of the most significant archaeological finds in post-war American history, revealing not merely a preserved amusement park but a comprehensive archive of corporate culture and technological achievement that had remained sealed and protected throughout 2 centuries of nuclear winter and social collapse. The massive theme park complex that John Caleb Bradburton had envisioned as the ultimate celebration of his beverage empire had become something far more valuable than entertainment, a time capsule that preserved the complete story of how pre-war America had transformed simple refreshment into a cultural phenomenon that shaped consumer behavior, social identity, and corporate power on a scale that had never before been achieved in human civilization. The park's preservation was nothing short of miraculous, with environmental control systems and automated maintenance protocols that had continued functioning long after their creators had been reduced to radioactive ash, creating sealed environments where exhibits, documents, and manufacturing equipment remained in pristine condition, despite the chaos that had consumed the outside world. The power systems that sustained these preservation efforts represented engineering achievements that exceeded anything post-war communities had managed to maintain, suggesting technological sophistication that had been lost during the civilizational collapse that followed the Great War. The corporate archives that researchers discovered within the park's administrative facilities contained documentation that provided unprecedented insight into the business practices, marketing strategies, and product development processes that had enabled Nuka-Cola to achieve its dominant position in pre-war American commerce. These records revealed not only the public face of corporate success, but the private calculations, ethical compromises, and strategic decisions that had shaped the company's evolution from modest startup to industrial empire. The holotapes and written records that had been preserved in climate-controlled storage revealed conversations, memos, and planning documents that chronicled decades of corporate decision-making with a level of detail that historians had never before been able to access. These materials provided evidence of the systematic planning that had gone into market manipulation, competitor elimination, and consumer psychology research that had enabled Nuka-Cola to maintain its dominance even when facing well-funded opposition from established beverage companies. The mixing station technology that researchers discovered in the park's research facilities represented one of the most advanced examples of automated food production that had ever been documented, with chemical processing capabilities that could combine different Nuka-Cola variants in precise proportions to create entirely new products with enhanced effects and novel characteristics. These machines had continued operating throughout the post-war period, maintained by artificial intelligence systems that had adapted to changing conditions while preserving the essential knowledge needed to create specialized beverage combinations. The new combinations that could be produced using this preserved technology exceeded anything that had been available during the pre-war period, with mixed drinks that provided healing, radiation resistance, and performance enhancement effects that seemed almost magical to wastelanders accustomed to the simple survival benefits of individual variants. The Nuka-Cola cooler that combined quantum, victory, and quartz created healing effects that exceeded the most advanced medical treatments available in post-war communities, providing over 1,000 hit points of restoration, along with permanent increases to maximum health and action point capacity. The previously unknown variants that were discovered in the park's research vaults revealed the extent to which Bradburton's scientists had experimented with formulations that pushed far beyond conventional understanding of what beverages could accomplish for human physiology and psychology. These experimental products included alcoholic variants, fruit combinations that had never been released to the public, and radioactive formulations that made even quantum seem conservative in their approach to performance enhancement through chemical modification. The Nuka-Cola Dark that represented the company's entry into the alcoholic beverage market demonstrated sophisticated understanding of fermentation, chemistry, and flavor balancing that combined traditional brewing techniques with the advanced food science that had made the original formula successful. The 35% alcohol content exceeded most commercial spirits while maintaining the distinctive Nuka-Cola flavor profile that consumers associated with quality and innovation, creating products that could serve both recreational and medicinal purposes in post-war communities where traditional painkillers and antiseptics were virtually unavailable. The orange and grape variants that had been developed but never widely released revealed corporate strategies for market segmentation and demographic targeting that involved creating different products for different consumer groups rather than attempting to serve all preferences with a single formula. The research documents that accompanied these products showed detailed analysis of consumer psychology, regional preferences, and competitive positioning that reflected marketing sophistication that exceeded anything attempted by rival companies during the same period. The corporate espionage operations that were documented in the park's security archives revealed the extraordinary lengths to which Nuka-Cola had gone to maintain its competitive advantages through industrial intelligence, gathering, sabotage operations, and legal manipulation that systematically undermined potential competitors while creating market conditions that favored continued expansion of Bradburton's empire. These operations employed former government agents, advanced surveillance technology, and financial resources that exceeded the budgets of many small nations. The sabotage activities that were documented in classified files showed systematic campaigns to disrupt competitor operations through everything from contaminated ingredients to equipment failures that appeared accidental but were actually the result of careful planning and execution by professional operatives working under corporate contracts. These activities extended beyond simple business competition into areas that would have been considered criminal if they had been exposed during the pre-war period. The legal strategies that Nuka-Cola employed to eliminate competition included patent manipulation, regulatory capture, and political influence operations that shaped government policy in ways that favored large corporations over small businesses and regional competitors. The documentation revealed systematic corruption of regulatory agencies, judges, and elected officials who received everything from direct payments to stock options in exchange for decisions that protected Nuka-Cola's market position. The employee testimony that was preserved in Human Resources archives provided first-hand accounts of working conditions, corporate culture, and management practices that revealed both the benefits and costs of employment with one of America's most successful corporations. These records showed how Nuka-Cola maintained employee loyalty through generous compensation packages, while simultaneously demanding absolute secrecy and unquestioning obedience to corporate policies that sometimes conflicted with personal ethics and legal requirements. The research and development documentation revealed the systematic process through which new products were conceived, tested, and refined through extensive market research and consumer testing that involved thousands of participants and millions of dollars in research expenditures. These studies provided detailed analysis of how different demographic groups responded to various flavor combinations, marketing messages, and pricing strategies, creating databases of consumer psychology that enabled precise targeting of specific market segments. The environmental impact studies that were conducted but never released publicly showed that Nuka-Cola's manufacturing operations had created significant pollution and resource depletion that the company had actively concealed from regulatory agencies and the general public through falsified reports, bribery, and legal intimidation of potential whistleblowers. These studies documented environmental damage that had contributed to the ecological instability that characterized the pre-war period. The true cost of Nuka-Cola's market dominance became apparent through financial records that showed how the company had achieved profitability through external cost shifting that made taxpayers and local communities bear the porting. Expenses of environmental cleanup, worker healthcare, and infrastructure maintenance that should have been corporate responsibilities. This cost shifting enabled artificial pricing that made Nuka-Cola products appear more affordable while actually imposing hidden expenses on society as a whole. The manufacturing processes that were documented in technical manuals revealed production shortcuts and quality compromises that had been implemented to reduce costs while maintaining profit margins, including ingredient substitutions that reduced nutritional value and safety testing procedures that minimized discovery of potential health risks. These shortcuts were justified through internal cost-benefit analyses that weighed corporate profits against consumer welfare in ways that consistently favored financial considerations over public health. The park facilities themselves represented monuments to corporate excess and consumer manipulation, with attractions designed not merely to entertain visitors but to reinforce brand loyalty and increase product consumption through psychological techniques that had been developed by advertising specialists and behavioral product psychologists. The immersive environments created associations between Nuka-Cola consumption and positive emotional experiences that would influence purchasing decisions long after visitors had returned to their normal routines. The advanced automation systems that maintained park operations demonstrated technological capabilities that exceeded anything that post-war communities had been able to preserve or recreate, suggesting that pre-war corporate research had achieved breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, robotics, and materials science that had been lost during the civilizational collapse that followed nuclear warfare. These systems continued to function with minimal maintenance while adapting to changing conditions in ways that suggested genuine machine intelligence. The preservation of complete manufacturing equipment within the park's production facilities enabled post-war researchers to reverse engineer industrial processes that had been forgotten during the chaos that followed the last Great War, providing opportunities to restore limited production of specialized variants that could serve medical and nutritional needs in wasteland communities that had been surviving on scavenged materials for 2 centuries. The cultural impact of these discoveries extended far beyond historical interest into practical applications that could improve survival prospects and quality of life for post-war populations struggling with resource scarcity, medical challenges, and social organization problems that had characterized the wasteland period. The knowledge preserved in Nuka-World archives provided templates for industrial organization, quality control, and distribution systems that could be adapted to serve current needs while avoiding the ethical and environmental problems that had characterized pre-war corporate practices. The lessons learned from corporate archives revealed patterns of business behavior that had contributed to the social instability and resource conflicts that ultimately led to nuclear warfare, providing warnings about how unchecked corporate power and unregulated market competition could undermine the social cooperation and environmental stewardship that were essential for long-term human survival. These lessons became particularly relevant as post-war communities began developing their own economic systems and governance structures. The technological innovations that were preserved in research facilities provided foundations for rebuilding industrial capabilities that could serve post-war needs while incorporating safeguards against the environmental damage and preserved social exploitation that had characterized pre-war corporate practices. The chemical processing equipment, quality control systems, and distribution technologies could be adapted to produce not only beverages, but medicines, nutritional supplements, and other essential products that were desperately needed in wasteland communities. And so the discovery of Nuka-World completed the transformation of a simple beverage company into a comprehensive case study of corporate power, technological achievement, and social responsibility that would influence how future generations understood both the possibilities and dangers of industrial civilization. The preserved archives provided both inspiration for what human ingenuity could accomplish and warnings about how that same ingenuity could be directed toward purposes that ultimately undermined the foundations of the society that had made such achievements possible. The Western territories of post-war America had developed their own distinct beverage cultures that reflected both the unique environmental conditions of desert survival and the independent spirit of communities that had maintained greater distance from the centralized corporate influence that had dominated the eastern seaboard during the final decades before the Great War. Among these regional alternatives to Nuka-Cola's national dominance, none had achieved greater success or cultural significance than Sunset Sarsaparilla, the brown bottled beverage that had captured the imagination of cowboys, ranchers, and frontier settlers who valued authenticity and tradition over the flashy innovations that characterized more modern corporate products. The rise of Sunset Sarsaparilla as a serious competitor to Nuka-Cola represented one of the most fascinating examples of how regional preferences and cultural identity could create market segments that even the most sophisticated national marketing campaigns struggled to penetrate effectively. The company had been founded in 1918, nearly 30 years before Bradburton's first successful cola formula, giving it the kind of deep cultural roots and established customer loyalty that could not easily be displaced by superior marketing budgets or technological innovations. The cowboy marketing that had made Sunset Sarsaparilla successful throughout the southwestern territories was not merely a calculated appeal to regional stereotypes, but reflected genuine understanding of the values and lifestyle preferences that characterized communities where self-reliance, independence, and skepticism toward corporate authority remained stronger than in the urbanized eastern regions where Nuka-Cola had achieved its greatest success. The advertising campaigns featured real working cowboys and ranchers whose testimonials carried authentic credibility that manufactured celebrity endorsements could not match. The distinctive taste of sarsaparilla itself represented a connection to 19th century American beverage traditions that had been largely displaced by modern cola formulations, but retained strong nostalgic appeal among consumers, who associated the flavor with simpler times and more honest business practices. The root beer-like characteristics of sarsaparilla provided a completely different sensory experience from the fruit-heavy sweetness of Nuka-Cola variants, creating loyal customer bases that viewed their beverage choice as an expression of personal identity and cultural values. The manufacturing facilities that Sunset Sarsaparilla had established throughout the Western Territories were deliberately smaller and more regionally focused than Nuka-Cola's massive industrial operations, creating production systems that could maintain closer relationships with local communities while providing employment and economic benefits that were distributed more broadly than the concentrated wealth that characterized large corporate operations. These facilities used locally sourced ingredients whenever possible, creating economic multiplier effects that benefited entire regional economies. The rise and fall of Vim Corporation in the main territories provided another compelling example of how regional beverage companies could achieve local dominance while struggling to expand beyond their original market areas. demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of competing against national brands that possessed superior resources and distribution capabilities. Vim had been established in 1931, predating Nuka-Cola by over a decade and achieving such strong local penetration that it had nearly become the official state beverage of Maine. The corporate culture that Vim had developed emphasized connection to local traditions and environmental stewardship in ways that contrasted sharply with the growth-focused, profit-maximizing approach that characterized larger national corporations. The company's marketing emphasized how their products were made with Maine water, Maine ingredients, and Maine values, creating emotional connections that transcended simple taste preferences to encompass regional pride and environmental consciousness. The legal battles that erupted between competing beverage companies during the pre-war period revealed the extent to which trademark law, advertising regulations, and corporate litigation had become weapons in commercial warfare that sometimes overshadowed actual product competition in determining market outcomes. The dispute between Vim and Nuka-Cola over the use of quartz as a product name demonstrated how intellectual property conflicts could drain resources and energy that might otherwise have been devoted to innovation and customer service. The trademark litigation that surrounded the quartz naming dispute revealed systematic corporate strategies for using legal processes to harass smaller competitors and create barriers to market entry that had little relationship to genuine intellectual property protection, but served effectively to discourage competition from companies that lacked the financial resources to engage in extended legal battles with well-funded corporate legal departments. The underhanded tactics that Nuka-Cola employed against regional competitors went far beyond normal business competition into areas that included industrial sabotage, false advertising campaigns, and regulatory manipulation designed to create market conditions that favored large national corporations over smaller regional companies that lacked the political influence and financial resources needed to protect themselves against systematic corporate assault. The propaganda campaigns that Nuka-Cola launched against Sunset sarsaparilla included supposedly independent studies that claimed to identify health risks associated with traditional sarsaparilla ingredients, creating public concerns that were based on selective data interpretation and methodological flaws that would not have survived peer review, but were effective in generating negative publicity that damaged competitor reputation and market share. The response strategies that regional companies developed to counter these attacks often required them to divert resources from product development and customer service toward legal defense and public relations efforts that provided no direct benefit to consumers but were essential for corporate survival in an increasingly hostile competitive environment. These defensive expenditures reduced the efficiency advantages that smaller companies might otherwise have possessed through their more focused operations and closer community relationships. The cultural significance of beverage choice in different regions reflected deeper social and political divisions that characterized pre-war American society, with consumption patterns that served as markers of regional identity, class affiliation, and political orientation in ways that transcended simple taste preferences to encompass complex social signaling about values, aspirations, and group membership that influenced everything from dating prospects to business relationships. The regional preferences that persisted despite intensive national marketing campaigns demonstrated the limits of corporate power to homogenize consumer culture completely. With geographic and demographic segments that maintain distinctive characteristics even under sustained pressure from advertising, promotion, and distribution strategies designed to create uniform national markets that could be served efficiently by centralized production and marketing systems. The preservation of different soda cultures in various regions during the post-war period reflected both the practical advantages of local production and the psychological importance of maintaining cultural continuity during periods of extreme social disruption and uncertainty. Communities that had maintained access to regionally distinctive beverages often showed greater social cohesion and cultural resilience than areas that had been more thoroughly integrated into national consumer markets. The role of local bottling facilities in post-war survival became particularly important as transportation networks collapsed and long-distance distribution became impossible, creating situations where communities with preserved regional bottling operations possessed significant advantages in maintaining nutrition, hydration, and morale that contributed to their ability to survive and eventually prosper during the Reconstruction period that followed the immediate post-war chaos. The corporate espionage that characterized relationships between major beverage companies during the pre-war period included systematic efforts to steal formulas, production techniques, and marketing strategies that involved former intelligence operatives, advanced surveillance technology, and infiltration operations that would have been considered acts of industrial warfare if they had been conducted between nations rather than corporations. The counterintelligence operations that companies like Sunset Sarsaparilla and Vim developed to protect themselves from corporate spying required security measures that rivaled government intelligence agencies. With compartmentalized information systems, background investigations of employees, and surveillance detection procedures that consumed significant resources while creating workplace atmospheres of suspicion and paranoia that undermined the collaborative relationships that had traditionally characterized smaller companies. The economic impact of these corporate conflicts extended far beyond the beverage industry into broader patterns of market concentration and competition that influenced how American capitalism evolved during the final decades before the Great War, with successful large corporations using their advantages in legal resources, political influence, and financial capability to eliminate smaller competitors through methods that often had little relationship to efficiency, innovation, or customer satisfaction. The lobbying efforts that major beverage companies directed toward regulatory agencies and elected officials created policy environments that systematically favored large corporations over smaller competitors through tax policies, regulatory requirements, and enforcement practices that imposed disproportionate costs on companies that lacked the resources to comply with complex administrative requirements or influence the political processes that determined regulatory outcomes. The international dimensions of beverage competition included efforts by American companies to prevent foreign competitors from entering domestic markets while simultaneously attempting to expand their own operations into overseas territories where established local companies possessed advantages similar to those that American regional companies had enjoyed before facing assault from national corporate giants with superior resources and political connections. The technological innovations that emerged from competitive pressures included advances in bottling equipment, preservation techniques, and quality control systems that benefited the entire industry, while often being developed by smaller companies that lacked the resources to protect their innovations through patent systems that favored well-funded corporate legal departments over individual inventors and small businesses that had created the underlying technologies. The post-war discovery of competitor archives and corporate records provided comprehensive documentation of how beverage competition had been conducted during the pre-war period, revealing patterns of corporate behavior that helped explain both the economic instability and social tensions that had contributed to the political conditions that ultimately led to nuclear warfare between nations that had been unable to resolve resource conflicts through diplomatic negotiation. The wasteland communities that formed around preserved beverage production facilities often developed social structures and cultural practices that reflected the corporate cultures and regional identities that had been associated with different brands during the pre-war period, creating post-war societies that maintained some continuity with pre-war regional characteristics while adapting to the harsh realities of survival in contaminated environments. The lessons learned from pre-war beverage competition became particularly relevant for post-war communities that were attempting to rebuild economic systems and social institutions that could avoid the destructive patterns of corporate behavior that had contributed to pre-war social instability and resource conflicts, providing both positive examples of successful regional businesses and negative examples of how unchecked corporate power could undermine social cooperation and environmental sustainability. And so the Great Soda Wars of the pre-war period concluded not with decisive victory for any particular company or approach, but with the mutual destruction that nuclear warfare imposed on all participants, leaving behind only preserved products, abandoned facilities, and archived records that would serve as evidence of both the creative potential and destructive consequences of unregulated corporate competition in an economic system that had prioritized short-term profits over long-term social stability and environmental stewardship. The scientific analysis that post-war communities attempted to conduct on preserved Nuka-Cola samples represented one of the most ambitious research projects undertaken during the Reconstruction period, requiring collaboration between scattered settlements that possessed different pieces of the technological infrastructure and specialized knowledge needed to understand how 2 centuries of radioactive exposure had transformed these beverages from simple consumer products into complex chemical systems with properties that seem to violate conventional understanding of food science, radiation biology, and materials preservation. The analytical challenges that researchers faced were compounded by the limited laboratory equipment and reference materials available in post-war conditions, where sophisticated instruments had been destroyed during the nuclear attacks, or had degraded beyond functionality during the intervening decades of environmental exposure and technological neglect. The spectrometers, chromatographs, and other precision instruments that would have been essential for proper chemical analysis existed only in fragmentary form, requiring creative improvisation and cross-referencing between multiple crude analytical methods to develop reliable data about beverage composition and properties. The chemistry behind radiation resistance that many Nuka-Cola variants had developed during their long storage remained one of the most puzzling aspects of post-war beverage science, with preservation characteristics that exceeded anything that had been documented in pre-war food science literature or predicted by theoretical models of how organic compounds should respond to extended radiation exposure. The sugar molecules that formed the foundation of most Nuka-Cola formulations had somehow maintained their structural integrity despite radiation levels that should have caused extensive molecular breakdown and chemical degradation. The healing properties that various Nuka-Cola products provided to wasteland consumers appeared to result from complex interactions between radioactive isotopes, organic compounds, and trace minerals that created therapeutic effects through mechanisms that remained poorly understood by post-war medical researchers who lacked access to the sophisticated biochemical knowledge that had been lost during the collapse of pre-war educational and research institutions. The 10 health points of restoration that regular Nuka-Cola provided seemed to result from rapid glucose absorption that enabled immediate cellular energy production, while the caffeine content provided circulatory stimulation that improved nutrient distribution and waste removal at the tissue level. But these conventional explanations could not account for the dramatic healing acceleration that occurred with consumption, suggesting additional biochemical pathways that had been activated through radiation-induced molecular changes. The enhanced variants like Quantum and Victory provided healing effects that exceeded anything that could be explained through normal nutritional mechanisms, with restoration capabilities that rivaled the most advanced medical treatments available in pre-war hospitals and exceeded anything that post-war communities had been able to develop through conventional pharmaceutical research. The 400 health points that Quantum could provide represented healing acceleration that bordered on regenerative medicine, enabling rapid recovery from injuries that would normally require weeks or months of conventional treatment. The action point enhancement that quantum and other specialized variants provided appeared to result from neurochemical changes that increased reaction speed, coordination, and physical endurance through pathways that remained mysterious to post-war researchers who lacked the neurological expertise needed to understand how radioactive beverages could enhance cognitive and motor performance. The effects resembled stimulant drugs but lasted longer and provided performance improvements that exceeded anything achieved through conventional pharmacology. The mystery of sustained carbonation in products that had been stored for over 2 centuries challenged fundamental understanding of gas solubility and chemical stability. With carbon dioxide retention that defied conventional physical chemistry while providing sensory experiences that remained identical to fresh products, despite obvious environmental exposure and storage conditions that should have eliminated effervescence within months of original production. The preservation mechanisms that had maintained flavor integrity across such extended time periods suggested either remarkable advances in food science that had not been documented in available pre-war literature or chemical changes induced by radiation exposure that had created new forms of molecular stability that exceeded anything previously understood about organic compound preservation under adverse environmental conditions. The glowing variants that included quantum, victory, and quartz presented particularly interesting analytical challenges because their luminescence appeared to result from different mechanisms that created similar visual effects through distinct chemical pathways. Quantum's blue glow could be attributed to Cherenkov radiation from strontium-90 decay, but Victory's orange-red luminescence and quartz's white glow suggested alternative radioactive additives that had not been identified in available pre-war documentation. The scientific explanation for these different luminescence patterns required understanding of nuclear chemistry and radiation physics that exceeded the educational background of most post-war researchers, creating theoretical gaps that led to speculation and folklore that mixed genuine observations with imaginative explanations that reflected the limited scientific knowledge available in wasteland communities. The role of preservatives in enabling 2-century survival became a crucial area of research that revealed sophisticated pre-war chemical engineering that had created preservation systems capable of maintaining product integrity under environmental conditions that had never been anticipated by the original formulators. The preservative compounds appeared to have created chemical environments that were inherently hostile to bacterial growth while simultaneously protecting organic compounds from radiation-induced degradation. The potassium benzoate and other preservatives that had been identified in original Nuka-Cola formulations seemed insufficient to explain the extraordinary preservation that had been achieved, suggesting additional chemical additives that had not been disclosed in public documentation but had been incorporated to provide protection against environmental challenges that pre-war planners had anticipated but not publicly acknowledged. The comparison with modern wasteland brewing techniques revealed how post-war communities had developed fermentation and preservation methods that drew upon pre-war knowledge while adapting to resource constraints and bold environmental conditions that required creative solutions to basic problems of food safety and storage stability. The contrast between crude post-war preservation methods and the sophisticated chemistry that had enabled Nuka-Cola's survival highlighted the technological regression that had occurred during the Reconstruction period. The pharmaceutical applications that wasteland medical practitioners had discovered represented one of the most promising areas of practical research. With treatment protocols that had been developed through trial and error, providing therapeutic benefits that exceeded conventional medical approaches, while utilizing resources that were relatively abundant in most settled areas where Nuka-Cola products could be scavenged from ruins or obtained through trade networks. The radiation resistance properties that certain variants provided appeared to result from chemical compounds that could enhance cellular repair mechanisms or provide protective effects against DNA damage from environmental radiation exposure. The grape variant's ability to reduce accumulated radiation damage by 400 rads exceeded the effectiveness of Radaway and other specialized anti-radiation pharmaceuticals, while being more readily available and easier to administer than conventional medical treatments. The dosage calculations that medical practitioners had developed through clinical experience provided guidelines for using different Nuka-Cola variants as treatments for specific conditions, with protocols that balanced therapeutic benefits against potential side effects like addiction, radiation exposure, or metabolic disruption that could result from excessive consumption of highly concentrated chemical formulations. The environmental science applications that emerged from Nuka-Cola research included studies of how industrial food production had affected regional ecosystems during the pre-war period, with chemical signatures and environmental impacts that could be detected in soil samples and water sources centuries after the original industrial operations had been destroyed in nuclear attacks. The ecological impact assessments that were conducted around preserved Nuka-Cola facilities revealed complex environmental relationships between industrial chemistry and biological systems, with some areas showing enhanced plant growth that appeared to result from nutrient enrichment, while other locations displayed signs of chemical contamination that had created sterile zones where normal ecological recovery had been prevented or delayed. The intersection of pre-war chemistry and post-war necessity created opportunities for technological innovation that could serve current needs while building upon preserved knowledge and resources that represented the accumulated expertise of pre-war research and development programs. The chemical processing equipment and analytical techniques that could be recovered from Nuka-Cola facilities provided foundations for rebuilding industrial capabilities that were essential for long-term community sustainability. The biochemical research that was conducted on human subjects who had consumed various Nuka-Cola products over extended periods revealed physiological adaptations that suggested these beverages had created metabolic changes that went beyond simple nutrition or temporary stimulation to encompass fundamental alterations in cellular chemistry and organ function that persisted long after individual consumption episodes had ended. The addiction patterns that were documented among regular consumers provided insights into neurochemical pathways that had been activated by specific chemical compounds in enhanced variants, creating dependency syndromes that resembled drug addiction but involved substances that were legally and culturally accepted as food products rather than controlled pharmaceuticals, complicating treatment approaches and social responses to problematic consumption patterns. The long-term health studies that were attempted with available research resources suggested both beneficial and harmful effects from regular Nuka-Cola consumption, with outcomes that appeared to depend upon individual genetic factors, consumption patterns, and environmental conditions that created complex relationships between beverage chemistry and human physiology that could not be easily predicted or controlled through simple dosage guidelines. The theoretical frameworks that post-war researchers developed to explain their observations often combined accurate empirical observations with speculative explanations that reflected both genuine scientific insight and the limitations of available knowledge and analytical capabilities, creating bodies of knowledge that would require future revision as more sophisticated research capabilities were developed, but provided useful, practical guidance for immediate applications. And so, the scientific investigation of Nuka-Cola's post-war properties revealed both the remarkable sophistication of pre-war food science and the enormous challenges that post-war communities faced in Bacters. Understanding and utilizing the technological heritage that had survived nuclear destruction, creating opportunities for practical applications, while highlighting the knowledge gaps that would need to be addressed through future research and educational development as human civilization gradually rebuilt its scientific capabilities. The cultural impact that Nuka-Cola achieved in preserving pre-war American identity extended far beyond its function as a beverage into the realm of collective memory and social cohesion, serving as one of the few tangible connections that post-war communities maintained to the prosperity, optimism, and technological confidence that had characterized American society during its final decades before nuclear destruction transformed everything familiar into something alien and dangerous. The distinctive bottles, familiar flavors, and corporate iconography provided psychological anchors that helped survivors maintain their sense of cultural continuity, even when every other aspect of their civilization had been reduced to radioactive rubble and scattered. Memories. The symbolic power that these preserved beverages possessed went beyond mere nostalgia to encompass deeper questions about what it meant to be American in a world where the United States as a political and cultural entity had ceased to exist, leaving behind only fragments of infrastructure, scattered populations, and artifacts like Nuka-Cola that carried encoded memories of values, aspirations, and social relationships that had defined a lost civilization. The act of consuming these beverages became a form of communion with ancestors who had inhabited a world of plenty and possibility that seemed almost mythological to descendants struggling with daily survival in contaminated wastelands. The role that Nuka-Cola played as a symbol of hope and normalcy during the darkest periods of post-war reconstruction provided communities with shared experiences that transcended the ethnic, religious, and regional divisions that might otherwise have prevented cooperation between groups that were competing for scarce resources while struggling to maintain basic social organization. The familiar taste provided common ground that enabled strangers to recognize each other as fellow inheritors of a shared cultural heritage worth preserving and defending against the chaos that threatened to reduce human existence to mere animal survival. The adaptation processes that different wasteland communities developed around Nuka-Cola reflected both practical necessities and creative responses to resource scarcity that transformed simple consumption into elaborate social rituals that served multiple functions ranging from entertainment and education to conflict resolution and spiritual practice. These adaptations demonstrated remarkable cultural flexibility that enabled communities to maintain meaningful connections to pre-war traditions while developing new customs that served current needs and circumstances. The trade networks that developed around Nuka-Cola distribution created economic relationships that extended far beyond simple commerce into political alliances and cultural exchange that helped isolated communities maintain connections with broader regional developments while preserving local autonomy and cultural distinctiveness. The standardized value that different variants possessed enabled complex multi-party transactions that might otherwise have been impossible in barter economies where determining fair exchange rates required extensive negotiation and mutual trust. The social hierarchies that emerged around access to rare variants reflected both genuine differences in capability and resource management, while simultaneously creating new forms of inequality that sometimes undermined community, cooperation, and social cohesion. The psychological satisfaction that came from possessing and consuming prestigious variants could provide individual motivation and reward systems that encouraged productive behavior, but could also create resentment and conflict when perceived as unfair or excessive displays of privilege. The preservation of pre-war American identity through Nuka-Cola consumption became particularly important for communities that were attempting to maintain educational and cultural programs that would transmit knowledge and values to younger generations who had no direct memory of pre-war civilization. The beverages served as tangible examples of what technological sophistication and social organization could accomplish, providing inspiration for reconstruction efforts while simultaneously serving as warnings about the potential consequences of unchecked corporate power and environmental negligence. The psychological comfort that familiar flavors provided during periods of extreme stress and uncertainty helped individuals and communities maintain mental health and emotional stability that were essential for making the rational decisions and sustained commitments that successful survival required. The temporary escape from harsh reality that consumption could provide served important therapeutic functions while also creating risks of psychological dependence that could interfere with necessary adaptation to changed circumstances. The influence on post-war reconstruction efforts extended beyond individual consumption into community planning and resource allocation decisions that were shaped by memories and associations connected to pre-war prosperity and social organization. Communities that had access to Nuka-Cola often showed greater ambition and optimism in their reconstruction projects, suggesting that these tangible connections to pre-war achievements provided psychological foundations that supported long-term planning and collective action. The settlements that were built around Nuka-Cola facilities often developed distinctive cultural characteristics that reflected both the corporate culture that had originally created these installations and the adaptive innovations that post-war communities developed to manage preserved resources while serving current needs. These settlements frequently became regional centers for trade, education, and cultural development that extended their influence far beyond their immediate geographical boundaries. The brand evolution that occurred during the post-war period transformed Nuka-Cola from a corporate product into a cultural artifact whose meaning was determined by communities rather than marketing departments, creating new associations and symbolic significance that reflected post-war values and concerns rather than pre-war commercial objectives. This evolution demonstrated how cultural symbols could maintain their power and relevance even when their original context had been completely destroyed. The attempts to recreate original formulations represented both practical efforts to restore beloved flavors and symbolic projects that expressed community determination to reclaim and rebuild the technological capabilities that had made pre-war prosperity possible. These efforts often became focal points for educational programs, technical training, and community cooperation that served broader reconstruction goals while addressing immediate desires for familiar pleasures. The continuing search for the perfect cola became a metaphor for broader human aspirations toward improvement, innovation, and the creation of better conditions than those that current circumstances provided. This search maintained hope and motivation that were essential for long-term survival, while channeling creative energy toward constructive projects that could benefit entire communities rather than just individual consumers. The wasteland art that incorporated Nuka-Cola imagery and themes created new forms of cultural expression that combined pre-war iconography with post-war experiences and perspectives, producing artistic works that served both aesthetic and educational functions while providing emotional outlets for complex feelings about loss, survival, and hope that characterized the post-war experience. These artistic expressions helped communities process trauma while maintaining connections to cultural traditions that provided meaning and identity. The music and storytelling traditions that developed around Nuka-Cola created shared narratives that helped communities understand their place in historical continuity, while providing entertainment and educational content that could be transmitted across generations without requiring sophisticated technology or formal educational institutions. These oral traditions often incorporated moral lessons and practical knowledge, along with entertainment, serving multiple cultural functions through single artistic expressions. The religious and spiritual movements that incorporated Nuka-Cola symbolism demonstrated how communities created new forms of meaning and transcendence from available materials and experiences, developing belief systems that could provide comfort, motivation, and social cohesion, while addressing existential questions that had been raised by civilizational collapse and the apparent randomness of survival and death in post-war conditions. The community festivals and celebrations that featured Nuka-Cola consumption created shared experiences that strengthened social bonds while providing regular occasions for joy and recreation that were essential for maintaining morale and cultural vitality during the difficult process of rebuilding civilization from scattered remnants and preserved fragments of the previous world. The educational programs that used Nuka-Cola as teaching tools provided concrete examples for lessons about chemistry, history, economics, and social organization that might otherwise have remained abstract concepts without practical relevance to students whose immediate concerns focused on survival skills and resource management rather than academic knowledge that seemed disconnected from daily experience. The technological innovation that was inspired by efforts to understand and replicate Nuka-Cola led to broader advances in food science, chemistry, and manufacturing that served practical needs while demonstrating how curiosity and systematic investigation could produce knowledge and capabilities that improved living conditions and expanded possibilities for future development and henfei. Prosperity. The environmental restoration projects that were organized around Nuka-Cola facilities often became models for broader ecological recovery efforts that addressed contamination, habitat destruction, and resource depletion, while providing practical experience in environmental management and sustainable development that could be applied to other locations and challenges. The diplomatic relationships that developed between communities through Nuka-Cola trade created precedents and frameworks for peaceful cooperation that could be extended to other areas of mutual concern, providing foundations for regional stability and collective security that were essential for long-term prosperity and cultural development in areas that had been devastated by war and social collapse. And so Nuka-Cola completed its transformation from commercial product to cultural institution, serving as both bridge connecting past and future and foundation supporting the reconstruction of human civilization in forms that could incorporate the best achievements of the previous world while avoiding the mistakes and limitations that had ultimately led to nuclear destruction and social collapse, demonstrating how simple pleasures and familiar comforts could provide the psychological and social foundations necessary for rebuilding hope, cooperation, and shared commitment to creating better futures than the harsh realities of post-war existence had initially seemed to allow. And so concludes our journey through the effervescent history of Nuka-Cola, from laboratory experiment to wasteland legend. In the quiet moments before sleep, consider how this simple beverage became so much more than the sum of its ingredients, a symbol of human ingenuity, corporate ambition, and the enduring power of nostalgia. The blue glow of quantum may have faded with the passage of time, but the memory of that first perfect sip lives on in every bottle discovered in some forgotten corner of the wasteland. Whether it was the original cola, the mysterious quantum variant, or any of the countless flavors that followed, each bottle contained not just a drink, but a piece of the world that was. As you drift toward peaceful dreams, let the gentle fizz of carbonation be your lullaby, and know that somewhere in the wasteland, a traveler is discovering their first bottle of Nuka-Cola, tasting not just sugar and preservatives, but hope itself. The cola wars may be over, but the legend lives on, one bottle at a time, in the endless pursuit of the perfect refreshment.